Hi everyone. I am pleased to be joined today by Professor David Gibbs, an author of many books and also no, not recently, but also debated at one point Michael Chertoff, the former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, on these very key issues. And we're joined by him today to discuss neoconservatism. The rise of the rich and as well as humanitarian interventionism. So important and again very relevant topics. So yeah, it's great to finally get to meet you.
Thank you for having me on your show, Glenn.
Well, I wanted to start with the rise of neoconservatism because everyone hears about the neocons. Usually, it's associated with the Bush administration, but of course, this is a much longer history. This focus on strong interventionist foreign policy. To some, the concept of neoconservatism become a contradiction in terms as well. But how can you explain this phenomenon? Because once it first emerged, it wasn't so dominant. But how can you explain the what it is and the growing potency and how it's been spreading as well as certainly people looking today at the European Union, what used to be known as a peace project, it now looks more and more like a neocon project. So if we want to trace this back, how can we understand neoconservatism?
Well, let's look at the context. The context was U.S. defeat or impending U.S. defeat in Vietnam. That was becoming increasingly evident by the late 60s after the Tet Offensive, that the United States was not going to win this war. Of course, ultimately, it did not win the war. And you had, of course, the anti-war movement and increasing public negativity about not just the war, but the entire project of overseas expansion. It got a bad name in Vietnam. Um, so there was rising public skepticism, very clearly demonstrated in public opinion polls, represented by the anti-war movement, but also ordinary Americans are becoming very skeptical of the war. In the context, you had what was called the Vietnam Syndrome, which was a reluctance on the part of the public to support further overseas adventures and to support high military budgets. When Richard Nixon was elected, he actually lowered significantly the military budget to the lowest level of the Cold War. He didn't want to do that, but he had no choice because that's what the public was essentially demanding. Détente with the Soviets, a much more cooperative, negotiation-based relationship with the Soviets. You had the discrediting of major institutions of foreign policy, most notably the military, the presidency, especially after Nixon was evicted from office. The Central Intelligence Agency was damaged by public hearings by Senator Frank Church, the Church Committee hearings, which were devastating to its reputation. And I think all of these things created an atmosphere whereby the US empire was called into question. And the public simply wasn't supporting it anymore, at least not to the extent that it had. And in this context, you had a kind of backlash among certain elements of, first of all, the American elite, the business elite, most notably the cluster of organizations known as the military-industrial complex by President Eisenhower, but also U.S. overseas investors who were very worried about the security of their investments in unstable regions. They'd been protected by American aircraft carriers and bases, and it wasn't quite clear the United States would protect them like before. And so they began pouring huge amounts of money into a massive influence campaign. This was very closely connected with a simultaneous influence campaign to generate what's called neoliberalism, the shift to free market economics. And the two in tandem worked with great effect. And at the same time, you had a shift in American intellectual life, which is you had a group of top tier intellectuals, both at universities and sort of New York top tier writers, who had been liberals or even leftists in their youth. Famously, some of them had been Trotskyists in the 30s. They now shifted in a hard right wing direction. And they began, it's the term neoconservative, formerly left leaning, now right leaning. They became some of the most right wing thinkers in America. And the whole principle was, first of all, to overcome the Vietnam syndrome and to get over the disrespect for authority, but also the unwillingness to intervene overseas. And they were very heavily funded by the same interests that were funding the military-industrial. The military-industrial complex is, in essence, connected with this group. And the neoconservatives were essentially a very effective megaphone, you might say, because they were talented writers, very talented writers, and they could reach a broad audience with a kind of literary style and literary flair. And so the bottom line is that this group, which also, by the way, an important feature is they had a very extremely pro-Israel viewpoint. They increasingly viewed the experience of the Israel Defense Forces as an example of what America should be. The Israelis don't like to negotiate. They use force, and they use offensive force. And at least in the view of the neoconservatives, which isn't entirely true, they do it efficiently. The Israelis aren't always so efficient, but they looked efficient. And that was the basis of the neoconservative idea. And they had enormous influence, essentially shifting policy by the end of the 70s in a much more right-wing direction. And then they moved into the Reagan administration. They were associated with the Democratic Party, but they moved to the Republican Party quite seamlessly. They moved in between the two parties. And most recently, they moved back to the Democratic Party. They see that as much more conducive to their views. They've had what Rudi Dutschke of Germany called the long march through the institutions. Dutschke was a new leftist, but they did exactly what he proposed, which is that they completely transformed the entire discussion of foreign policy to the point that by now, the whole foreign policy establishment essentially has been converted to neoconservatism. There really isn't that much challenge to it within the establishment. And then they've moved across the Atlantic and increasingly the European foreign policy establishment, including in neutral countries or previously neutral countries like Sweden, now is entirely neoconservative. And so I think that's very much the basis of what we're seeing in both of the major wars taking place, in the war in Ukraine and also the war in the Middle East, or I should say wars in the Middle East. If you want to call them wars, what's going on in Gaza looks more like a orchestrated massacre, but let's call it war just for convenience sake. And so I think what we're seeing here is a generalized shift towards neoconservatism that's virtually without challenge, except for the Trump administration, which is completely outside the foreign policy consensus and is very hard to characterize. And also in Europe, you're getting populist parties, including, in my view, unsavory populist parties like the AfD in Germany, that are also outside that consensus. But within the consensus parties, neoconservatism is universal.
I was wondering though if the rise of narratives have much to do with this because one doesn't have to take this too far back, but in the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, it was the idea um, that it couldn't be admitted that the deal was done to remove the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. Instead, the argument was, well, we effectively stared them down, and yeah, they had to withdraw once we showed our military resolve. And again, I bring it up because even after the Cold War, a key criticism by Ambassador Jack Matlock was that they had agreed that the Cold War had ended through compromise, and he argued the lesson here should be that peace can be achieved through mutual understanding, diplomacy, and negotiations. However, he pointed out 2 years later, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that suddenly he called it myth making, which began right away. So suddenly the Cold War hadn't ended through diplomacy; it was won, and it had won because the U.S. had spent the Soviets into bankruptcy in Afghanistan, and also, but there's this general idea that they went toe to toe. They will showed the willingness to use force, stare down the Russians, and if just they showed enough military resolve and not standing down, then who would blink first? Well, it was the Russians, and this was how peace was created. One would defeat their adversaries. So, again, peace isn't mitigating the security competition or mutual understanding compromise. No, it's defeating your enemies. And from yeah, Matlock's argument, this could set a very dangerous mentality because it would now suggest this is how you create peace in the future through yeah pure militarism, as opposed to agreeing to make any compromises, which would simply then be appeasement. Do you see any merit to this, or how the yeah, because Afghanistan issue, this had a huge effect as well on the narrative of how the Cold War ended.
Yes, that's right. I think that what Jack Matlock is referencing is that the appearance was that there was a certain symmetry in the Cold War, that Gorbachev and Reagan symmetrically both agreed to end the Cold War by negotiation. But behind the scenes, I think there was a certain tendency, neoconservative, once again, in essence, led by key neoconservatives, notably Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who basically saw there were two views at the end of the Cold War. One is the U.S. had no enemies. The enemy had become a friend. First of all, it dissolved, the Soviet Union dissolved, and then Russia was pretty close to a vassal state of the United States at first. It was incredibly weak, and Yeltsin was in no position to challenge the United States. And I think that the one view, as I said, was that there was this situation where the U.S. had no enemies. That's a good thing, not to have enemies. But a second view emerged. In the first place, there was an anxiety about not having enemies, and people openly said they missed the Cold War, and maybe we need a new enemy because how do you justify hundreds of American military bases overseas? How do you justify NATO? NATO's whole purpose, after all, had been to repel or dissuade a Soviet invasion. There was no Soviet Union anymore, so you don't need NATO. How do you justify NATO? Um, and how do you justify a Cold War military budget in the United States or anything even close to a military budget of that size? The public was demanding a peace dividend. So there was an anxiety about that. And there was also a certain sense among some of the most hardcore neoconservatives, notably, again, Wolfowitz, that the end of the Cold War offered a unique opportunity to the United States, never offered to any great power in history, which is that the United States could establish a position of unipolarity, a global dominance with no peer over the entire globe that had never been achieved before, not by the Roman Empire, not by the British, not by the Dutch, not even briefly by the Germans or the Japanese, not by the US during the Cold War, but now, after the Cold War, the US was in a position to do this. And his position, Wolfowitz's position, was that this is the main focus of US foreign policy should be upon seizing this moment, not giving up American dominance or any kind of peace dividend in his view, but seizing the moment and projecting American influence as far into the future as possible and intimidating countries that wanted to even think about challenging the United States and sidelining the United Nations as much as possible. There's talk about making the UN Security Council a genuine arbiter of international conflict, which was, of course, the idea originally in 1945. And the idea was now we could be able to actually do that after the Cold War. And Wolfowitz insisted, no, it would be a unilateral, unipolar world emanating from Washington. And this was embodied in a secret document called the 1992 Defense Planning Guidance document, which laid out everything I said and spoke about US allies in very condescending or adversarial terms, most notably Germany and Japan. The European Union, was seen as a potential challenger to American power. And the idea was the US should use its influence to try and weaken the European Union and instead make NATO the main force in Europe as instead of the EU. And this was a very aggressive document. It was leaked to the New York Times, which is how we know about it. And the Bush administration tried to disown it because it was seen was so aggressive. The American allies were protesting it, and the New York Times editorialized against it, and so on. But in reality, I think this was the founding document of American foreign policy after the Cold War was over. This was the counterpart to NSC 68, if you will, which was the founding document of the Cold War in the earlier era. This would be the new NSC 68. And I think this is very much the document that is still with us today, or at least was. What Trump's going to do is almost anybody's guess. I don't think he knows what he wants to do, but up until Trump threw in a wild card, this document, the Defense Planning Guidance document, was, I would say, the key document in understanding the entire U.S. foreign policy after the Cold War ended. And it was to be one of aggressiveness and creation of enemies. It talked about China as a potential enemy, Russia as a potential enemy, even though Russia was on its knees at the time. And there was a certain tone of it looking for enemies. And if you look for enemies, you will find enemies. And of course, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it's almost a direct quote from James Baker at the time, which is if we keep looking for trying to make Russia into an enemy, it would be an enemy. But yeah, I remember the JPG because it came, it all happened so quickly. Again, in the, first in December of 1991, you had the Soviet Union, which dissolved. And the month after, in January of 1992, you had the Bush gave the State of the Union speech where he made it clear the Cold War didn't simply end, it was won. And then he continued saying, America used to be the leader of the world. We're now the leader of the West. Now we're the leader of the world. And this was yeah, kind of signaled already some intent. And then I think it was in February of 92, then yeah, when the New York Times leaked this document, and it was yeah, extraordinary because, as you also pointed out, the main foreign policy of the Russians at that time was to get as close as possible to the Americans and the West, and still the document it even referred to the Eurasian heartland in the language of Mackinder, that this is the Russians will still pretty much be our threat. It also called for an early introduction of a global anti-missile system, which would be the what was pushed in yeah, withdrawing from the ABM treaty in 2001. But again, not only adversaries, but this is the allies as well, creating concerns about Japan, Germany, again,
Yeah,
allies.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
But this
Potential
is the
enemy
problem,
partners.
though, isn't it? In a hegemonic system, it must to some extent lean upon an alliance system, doesn't it? Once you have rivals emerging at the periphery, then it's no longer, or new centers of power, then it's no longer unipolar. And also the whole principle of peacetime alliance. If you can divide a region into dependent allies or weakened adversaries, so dependent Germans against a weakened Russia, or yeah, dependent Arabs versus a weakened Iran, it's hard to avoid pursuing such a system if hegemony is the objective, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I think that in the 1990s, the main threat the US saw actually wasn't even Russia or China. It was actually Europe, the European Union. And people forget this. It's a very forgotten period of history. But France, from Charles de Gaulle onward, of course, had always called for an independent French foreign policy, which he sort of achieved, and an independent European foreign policy, which he did not achieve. But after the end of the Cold War, the Germans were increasingly taking the same view as the French. And that was, of course, the driving motor of the EU, or EC at the time. The idea was that with the ending of the Cold War, there was an assumption that NATO would just wither away as irrelevant. And stepping into the breach would be the European Union. The European states knew they couldn't really challenge American hegemony individually. They were just too weak for that. But collectively, it was felt they could act as something as a counterweight to American unilateralism. And there was a certain tone, I think, in Europe that the US was in a position to almost establish, nobody used this term, but almost like a global dictatorship or something close to that, unilateralism. That's the whole idea of it. And they felt that was an unhealthy situation, and Europe would act to at least check American power to some extent, at least in the economic and political realms, not so much in the military realms. And the United States saw that as a major threat and a major US concern during the 1990s, was trying to prevent that from taking place. To American anxiety, even the British were at times considering joining this effort at European independence. That must have been very unsettling to the Americans, given Britain's historic role. And it was one of the main concerns also of the Defense Planning Guidance document, which was undermining European unity if it was going to challenge NATO and establish NATO as the main pole of influence. As much as the United States likes to pretend that it views the Europeans as partners, views the Ukrainians as partners, in private, I think there's always been a tremendous condescension towards the Europeans as not serious countries. They're just under America's wing. And this does come out again and again. I mean, more recently, I think, in the intercepted conversation between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piot in 2014, Piot asked, well, what are the Europeans going to say about this? And she said, F the Europeans. I think that nicely summarizes the way the neocons have always seen American allies in private. In public, of course, they're more diplomatic. But I think in addition to that, one more thing that must be said about the Defense Planning Guidance document is it already started talking about not just preserving NATO, which was essential, because that was the jewel in the crown of American power overseas, but expanding NATO into the former communist states, directly in violation, of course, of the US agreement with Gorbachev never to do this, not 1 inch to the east. I think that was the phrase, or not 1 inch eastward, I think was what Baker said, and was repeated by not only US, but British, French, and German officials. And that was it was a talk about just brazenly violating that agreement and expanding NATO. And of course, that's exactly what happened.
So how do you fit the NATO expansion beyond, of course, canceling the not just the promises to Gorbachev, but indeed in Europe we did sign agreements such as the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, which laid I guess, the blueprint for how we're going to structure Europe after the Cold War. And it was very much based on the Helsinki Accords, so it come with principles such as indivisible security, Europe without dividing lines. But then suddenly, yeah, the Russians appear to be weak, and instead we got NATO expansion. But was NATO expansion just a result of this neocon instincts, or uh, did it also fuel it further? How do you see the role of
Oh,
NATO in the wider story of neoconservatism?
there's always economic interests involved in this. And in this case, you had the Committee to Expand NATO, I think was what it was called, which is financed by military contractors, US military contractors primarily. And the idea was that if NATO could expand into Eastern Europe, they would have to get rid of their, old Soviet era equipment and buy American, preferably, or maybe European equipment to replace it with enormous potential for profitability. And so that was a factor here. There were vested interests involved. There was a lobby group, the Project for the New American Century, many have heard of this, which basically called for a major increase in American military spending and a great expansion, further expansion of American military power overseas. And it became active during the late 1990s, was very influential in both parties, but especially in the Bush administration. And so it wasn't just free floating intellectuals based on ideas. Sometimes the neoconservatives are presented that way, but that's not the case at all. They're connected to powerful elite interests with a lot of money and resources who had a vested interest in expanding NATO. So I think it was a multiple set of features. There were other things too. The uniformed military had come to um, have a certain attachment to NATO, since so many of them had become admirals or generals based on NATO service, and that was part of their prestige, was overseas presence, and NATO was the core of America's overseas presence. At the end of the Cold War, there was an American admiral, Eugene Carroll, retired admiral, that basically said one of the main reasons you have calls for expanding NATO is uniformed personnel, people like him, uh, were simply too attached to the idea of America's overseas alliances and didn't want to give up the idea. So, uh, and the military-industrial complex is much broader, really, than just uniformed military and weapons producers. You have think tanks, you have elite academia, you have elite segments of journalism. It's a very broad network of people. And so I think all of these groups had a vested interest in not only maintaining but expanding NATO, just because partly it's in the nature of institutions to expand. I'm not a libertarian, but the libertarians do have a point in noting that when institutions are created, it's very hard to dismantle them, even after their purpose has disappeared. And if their old job disappears, they'll find a new job and they'll hunt for new business. It's exactly what happened with NATO and what happened more generally with the US, what Chalmers Johnson called the US empire of bases. And the idea was it's not just enough to preserve America's empire of bases, but if possible, expand it as much as possible.
It's well, I find the monetary reasons for expanding NATO to be, yeah, quite interesting, because at the time they spoke very openly about this in the 90s. That is yeah, the arms manufacturers could make billions of dollars when all the new NATO members would have to adjust to the new weaponry. And you mentioned this U.S. committee to expand NATO. The president of this was Bruce
Jackson,
Jackson,
Jackson, that's right.
and and this was his job. But he also had a different job. He was the director of strategic planning for Lockheed Martin.
That's right.
So,
That's right.
one would
Exactly.
think this would be a conflict of interest, but again, it does beg some question where all yeah where the monetary interest is, but beyond just the money, it does seem to some extent this is where the I guess the idealists and the neocons all locked hands because a lot of the idealism, and I'm not sure how far you would trace it back, because often one would go to Woodrow Wilson. He has this, to make the world safe for democracy, to fight the war that would end all wars. A lot of this, if not utopianism, or at least it's been argued that this under Wilson it changed the United States a bit from its values was supposed to be something to be admired and to be replicated or copied, to becoming instead some more of a outward civilizing mission, one where would one actively go out. Because if a little bit like the 90s, if when we started to think if democracy creates peace, let's go out in the world and create democracy. This was the argument of Kenneth Waltz actually in the late 90s, I think, was that the liberals had invented a new war, which was we're going to invade countries now to make the world more peaceful by turning them into democracy. So it is an interesting approach.
It is a very important point. The use of moral rhetoric and moralistic style. This has, of course, had many roots. Indeed, you mentioned probably the most important historically has been, of course, Woodrow Wilson, often invoked to this very day, the spirit of Woodrow Wilson and all that. And the main connection I would make historically is nevertheless, once again, the 70s and the neoconservative movement, because they were the main movers of this idea. And the context, again, was Vietnam. In the context of Vietnam, you had the rise of an international human rights movement centered in groups like Amnesty International. And initially, this was anti-interventionist. And the idea was that American interventionism had created a lot of the human rights abuses in places like the Greece under the colonels, Chile under Pinochet, South Vietnam, all the human rights abuses in Iran, which the U.S. had brought to power in the CI coup in '53. And these things were emphasized that the main driver of human rights abuses is American intervention. And Americans who were active in these groups insisted that as American citizens, they were less interested in human rights abuses by, let us say, the Soviet Union, because the argument was we are not citizens of the Soviet Union. And so we have less responsibility for what happens there. As American citizens, we have more responsibility to emphasize abuses resulting from our country's policy, which you could say is a logical and consistent argument. Nevertheless, of course, it opened them up to the claim that they're ignoring communist abuses. Maybe they're communists themselves and these kinds of things, these kinds of attacks, which of course were made. The neoconservatives initially were interested in power. And that was, I think, always what they were really interested in. I think they learned, however, to adopt and incorporate human rights into their language and make it their own, and to co-opt the whole idea of human rights. And this was done at first very cynically. A leading figure in the neoconservative movement was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, was a Harvard professor, a former liberal who became a right-winger. He later became a senator from New York, and he said in private, I think in 1976, in a letter, he said, "I have a funny feeling that human rights is actually our secret weapon." That was the term he used, our secret weapon. And the idea is, of course, that they could start focusing human rights on America's enemies. They focused heavily upon the use of psychiatric hospitals in the Soviet Union to punish political dissidents, the repression of people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, the vast human rights abuses being mass killings undertaken by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and so on. And they would emphasize that the whole purpose of American foreign policy is to prevent these kinds of things. And the main way we would do it is military force. And that people who oppose military force are amoral cynics, because really they are opposing human rights by opposing America's use of military force. The whole purpose of using military force is to advance human rights. And it was a powerful argument in the sense that it worked. It really did help completely divert the whole language of human rights to being one of being consonant with American power. Reagan himself later adopted this with great enthusiasm and with great emphasis upon, indeed, exporting democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy, which was largely founded as a close associate of the CIA, doing much of what the CIA does, but with a human rights rhetoric. We're promoting democracy. That was founded in 19, I think, 83, with strong support from the Reagan presidency. And so this was, I think at first it was cynical, although over time, I don't doubt that people tend to believe their own propaganda. And so very likely they internalized a lot of this language themselves. And what it did do was imbue the argument for military interventionism with a certain self-righteousness and a moralistic tone, and a very easy way to crush dissent, which is to denounce people as amoral cynics. It worked very effectively, I should add. And the high point of this, of course, was the wars in Yugoslavia. I've written a book on that, and it was far more complicated than people realize. One of the most effective things it did, however, was to end negotiations. The whole idea here is negotiations are immoral because you're negotiating with evil people. You can't negotiate with evil people. You need to crush them militarily. And people who don't believe in crushing them militarily are acting immorally. That was the argument in Yugoslavia. There were repeated efforts to settle Yugoslav wars, particularly in Bosnia and later in Kosovo, through negotiations. And they almost succeeded. And every time they almost succeeded. In 1992, the European Union and the United Nations had established a team and brought the warring parties in Bosnia-Herzegovina together in Lisbon and created a peace plan that devolved power in a decentralized way. And all three parties, the Muslims, the Serbs, and the Croats, in principle agreed to this. And the US ambassador came and said, you don't have to sign this if you don't want to, with the implication the US would back them on the battlefield, which it ultimately did. And so the Bosnian Muslims and the Croats backed out. And all along publicly, the line was that you can't negotiate with the Serbs because they're evil. As a result, we had a 3.5 year vicious war. 100,000 people died, including 8,000 at Srebrenica, who probably didn't have to die. But the whole logic was we can't negotiate because that's evil. And that was a major neoconservative idea, is military force instead of negotiations, which now was elevated to the level of high moral principle. And over time, I think this had a very important effect on the American political left. This is a matter of great interest to me, since I'll be frank and say I come from the political left. Back in the day, when I started becoming interested in these things, anti-interventionism was central to the idea of the political left. But I think in the 90s, that changed. And increasingly, the political left in the United States and in Europe, I think maybe most especially in Germany, was converted to the idea that humanitarian interventions are genuinely humanitarian and we should back them. And that the whole idea of military force being a bad thing is an obsolete idea, and the left should now back military force because it protects women from abuse, it protects them from, it protects ethnic minorities from being abused, being killed, and it has all sorts of benefits. More recently, the idea of gay rights was incorporated. We'll use military force to advance gay rights. I should add, these are terrible ideas because gays, women, they get killed by these things, is what it does. And war after war after war, what it's done is kill huge numbers of innocent people. It hasn't had any humanitarian effects. It sidelined negotiations that could have prevented war. It intensified wars. We overthrew Saddam Hussein. He was abusing his people. He was anti-democratic. He was torturing children. And things got much worse in Iraq. We overthrew the Taliban because they have terrible policies towards women, and they did, of course. And things got worse. We had a 20-year war for nothing. And I could go on and on. It's led to a series of disastrous wars, but of course, the ideas are so powerful, they just keep moving onward. And it's remarkable how the political left has been completely converted, or almost completely converted, to this idea of being pro-war in almost every area. The only exception being is in Israel and Gaza. The left is opposed to that, but every other war, the left seems to back to the hilt, maybe with more enthusiasm than the right. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. Do you want to interject anything there, Glenn?
No, no, I very much agree on what you said about Yugoslavia, because in 19 in the yeah within with Bosnia, the main argument was, they can't accept, it's immoral to accept that the Serbs holding these territories, but again, 100,000 deaths later, and there wasn't any changes really. It's just more deaths. And I also remember in end of the 90s, because I was in the army in 98, 99, and I remember in 99 with the invasion of Yugoslavia over Kosovo. Um, the Henry Kissinger himself, he argued that the U.S. placed what he argued to be unacceptable demands on Yugoslavia at the
Yep.
Rambouillet, I'm sure French will hate me for the way I'm pronouncing it, but a Rambouillet conference. He said that the demands that the U.S. put were not serious. He called, and again, this is Henry Kissinger, he called it an excuse to start bombing because they had put in the Appendix B, famous to,
That's right.
which demanded effectively NATO, for full occupation, have the right to go wherever they want within Yugoslavia. So it is an interesting, it is interesting how, uh, this normative argument for the use of force, how this has started to go hand in hand with this neoconservatism, and you saw this also in Germany to a very large extent. That is
Yeah.
in the yeah because after World War II, the main argument in Germany was, never again, we can't do this. However, in the 1990s, you had a former foreign minister, Joshua Fischer. He argued that he had been raised on two principles, and one was never end another war and never another Auschwitz. And now he argued in Kosovo, these two principles were in conflict. So now they had to embrace war. And not even embrace war, he argued instead of Germany's very violent history, which was a reason to have greater restraint in its foreign policy, Germany's genocide actually gave Germany a special responsibility to prevent it from happening other places. So it's a extraordinary shift that suddenly, one day your genocidal history is a reason for restraint. The next day, your genocidal history is a reason for why you should not be restrained anymore. It's quite, it's a fascinating development. I'm not sure if it's the values alone, which is the independent variable here, or is it the distribution of power that simply there were no restrictions on the West anymore. So perhaps this creates a systemic incentive to embrace all these norms and values, which removes restraints on us, but maintain them on our opponents.
Germany is an interesting case for reasons you noted. It's interesting because they did actually make a genuine effort to come to terms with their history, notably the Third Reich, World War II, the Holocaust, all of that. They have made a sincere effort to address that issue. I haven't been there recently, but I'm told all over Germany, not just in Berlin. There are plaques and commemorations for the Holocaust to victims of the Third Reich. And it seems very sincere. One of the things about it that's very tragic is this has led them, bizarrely, to be one of the staunchest supporters of Israel, not just verbally, but also people don't know this very well, but they're subsidizing Israel's military. They've built at below market cost very advanced submarines Israel is using as launch platforms for nuclear weapons. They've been doing this for a while now. And in the specific case, I think of Kosovo and Yugoslavia. Again, it's another tragic perversion, one might say, of the rhetoric of Germany's historic responsibility to own up to its responsibility for the Holocaust. And specifically, the problem you have with what Fisher was saying, the things you quoted him as saying, is that the human rights abuses in Kosovo massively increased due to the bombing. The total number of deaths up until the bombing on both sides, civilian and military, was estimated to be about 2,000. After the bombing, it was over 10,000. And so it didn't reduce the suffering, it didn't reduce the killing, it magnified it significantly. The ethnic cleansing was magnified many times. And all of this could have been avoided because there was a peace agreement almost signed by everybody at Rambouillet Castle outside of Paris, as you noted. And it was almost signed, and the Americans basically came in and insisted on torpedoing it by inserting at the last moment clauses they knew would be unacceptable to the Serbs, would have been unacceptable to any party in their situation. And it was done with the intent of breaking down the whole negotiation process and creating a basis for war. And America's motive in doing this, of course, was to establish NATO as a prestigious institution that it would win a war. There's no better way, of course, to establish the credibility of NATO than to win a war. And what better way to win a war than to go to war with a country like Serbia, which is extraordinarily weak? You can't miss by going to war with Serbia. And so I think basically what you had here is a classic example of the very cynical use of moralistic rhetoric to achieve uh, very unprincipled and power-based objectives with a very high cost in human lives.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting beyond former Yugoslavia, what kind of shockwaves this created around the world. Because the attack on Yugoslavia in March of 1999, it occurred. I think it was less than 2 weeks after NATO expanded.
That's right.
So this was the 1 month where NATO went from this role as more of a status quo power during the Cold War because then until suddenly in 99 where first it begins to expand and then also goes on the offensive. And this is again Kissinger. I remember he made this comment as well back in 99 where he said, well, we can't tell the Russians anymore that not to fear NATO's expansion, that we're just a defensive alliance, because obviously we're not anymore. And it was quite a dramatic development, which is I quote him sometimes because we still almost obligatory to refer to NATO as a defensive alliance, even when we're bombing other countries. It's quite extraordinary.
Well, they were doing all sorts of things to try and justify themselves, and including the whole idea that to change the charter to allow what's called out-of-area operations, meaning NATO would be a global interventionist force. And the phrase that went along with it was it's out of area or out of business. The idea is we have to have some new mission or we'll simply lose relevance. And again, the idea was to give them relevance. I think if you look at the memoirs of American officials and look at how they justify the interventions in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo, they have a lot of humanitarian justifications, which, as I said, are really incoherent, given the fact that it made the humanitarian situation much worse. But in addition to that, there's a frank acknowledgement that one motive was to give a new purpose to NATO and to sideline European efforts at establishing an independent foreign policy. And retrospectively, they noted that one of the main successes of these two wars was laying a basis for NATO's expansion, that the political basis for this was made possible by NATO victory in these two wars. And so it seems to me the main effect and the main motive here, when it looks at this coldly and objectively, was to preserve and expand NATO. That was the whole function of the war. And when it looks at just the style and tone of the Yugoslav wars, one can see this as almost a template for what is going on right now in Ukraine, including in the rhetoric.
Well, I guess all wars have to be sold in as morality, and this is why the human rights I think is quite powerful. Also, this is how political propaganda works, by the way. It's usually you have to frame it through two opposite the stereotypes, one which is superior versus inferior or good versus evil. It's very good to launder geopolitics and a great power rivalry through human rights versus authoritarianism. And we saw this, you mentioned before, at Afghanistan in the 20-year occupation. There was WikiLeaks. They had a document from, I think it was WikiLeaks came with it from the CIA. They noted that the Europeans were losing some interest and support for the occupation of Afghanistan, at least among the public. And they brainstormed that. Let's consider how it could best be sold. And as well, how about the women rights? This is popular. And later you have NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and Hollywood Angelina Jolie writing articles together in, I think it was The Guardian, where the headline was that NATO has the rights and responsibility to be the leading protector of women's rights. So
Imagine how many
it's quite
women.
extraordinary that like where does this come from? I mean, when you look at security strategies, they tend to be very open and frank. So, especially in the US from 2002, it's very clearly stated in the national security strategy that global primacy is the source of security. No one should even have the aspiration to challenge us. And then, how do we sell this to the public? And somehow people will open the newspaper. And yes, this is what the largest military alliance in the world is primarily concerned about for little girls to go to school. It's just. Well, I guess you get roped in a lot of the people who genuinely want to see more more rights in Afghanistan. But this is what I meant. It's the idealists starting to go hand in hand with the neoconservatives, the ones seeking global primacy through military force.
I imagine that Senator Moynihan, when he's talked about human rights as our secret weapon, he succeeded far beyond his wildest dreams. It's been incredibly effective in transforming discussion on this whole issue, shutting down dissent on this issue. One of the things also is just an extension of this is the way the culture wars are playing out with regard to Ukraine and Russia. And Russia has been uh, presented with some truth as being a socially conservative country, that they're not very friendly to gays, for example. I'm a fan of gay rights, by the way, so I personally, understand that this is an issue. But um, the whole idea here is that because of the gay rights issue, because of social conservatism, in America, the right has some affinity for the Putin government because it's socially conservative. It's aligned somewhat with religion. It's unfriendly to alternative lifestyles. And the left reviles the Putin government for the same, essentially parallel reason. Putin is a fascist. I hear my friends on the left say this all the time. He's a fascist, mostly based on culture war issues. And what the amazing thing is that even if you don't like Putin, and even if you don't like Russian culture for whatever reason, it's a terrible reason to start a war with Russia. I mean, it's an insane idea to get hundreds of thousands of people killed for that, which is what has happened here. But I think that's been the logic, that essentially we've set up this caricature, counterposed, of course, to a democratic and gay-friendly Ukraine. At one point, they were having as a spokesperson this American who was not only gay but trans, and the whole idea was plugging into the culture wars in a way that would address uh, culture war anxieties among liberals and leftists in the United States and in Europe. And they've been very effective in doing that. The Ukrainians have been very effective in doing that. Of course, in reality, Ukraine has a significant fascist element. We saw this on display in the Canadian Parliament, of course, when the entire Canadian Parliament got up in the presence of Zelensky, not only applauded Zelensky, but applauded a 98-year-old Ukrainian immigrant to Canada who fought in the SS. And, it was a major source of scandal and embarrassment in Canada after the fact. It was very entertaining in a certain grim way that the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament celebrated this man as somebody who fought against the Russians in World War II, and everybody applauded. And I was thinking, when I heard it, I thought, high school level knowledge of history would tell you that must have meant he was fighting with the Germans in World War II and was therefore fighting with the SS. But in any case, I think it did underscore the fact that these stereotypes people have about Russia, culturally bad Russia, culturally good Ukraine, doesn't really live up to its billing. But it's amazing how that propaganda has been so effective in structuring debate. Among all the mainstream left parties in Europe, among the Democrats in the United States, and among the activist left in the United States, groups like the Democratic Socialists of America have been largely silent on this issue or supportive of the war. And I think it's based largely upon these wildly unrealistic stereotypes that people have.
But it creates, I guess, too many contradictions. For example, in Europe, you mentioned that, well, and on the topic of neoconservatism being exported, because in the past, Europeans tended to look with great worry about, especially the Bush administration during the invasion of Iraq. Neocons were effectively looked upon irrational and yes, as warmongers, and Europe was supposed to be the balance to this. But today, Europe, I don't recognize it anymore
I don't
compared
either.
to 20 years ago. You mentioned Gaza, where the Germans, but also the EU itself, has comes with very strong statements in favor of Israel, even during what has been labeled a genocide. In Syria, I'm not sure if you if you caught it during all this mass murder of the Druze and the Alawites, the Shiites. Yeah, the Russians and the Americans, they put out condemnation of what the US referred to as radical Islamist jihadists or terrorists, yeah, along those lines, while the EU put out a tweet where it condemned the pro-Assad elements which had provoked this. So the people who were being massacred It's really strange. We have the foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas. She went out and said, "Well, I don't believe in diplomacy with the Russians because Putin is a war criminal, and I don't talk to war criminals." This is an extraordinary statement from the chief diplomat of the EU, and we have people like Viktor Orban, who he was punished by the EU for trying. He went to Kiev and then to Moscow, tried to start some diplomacy. They said that this undermined peace and the efforts by the Europeans. I remember across when Robert Fico of Slovakia, he was demonized, then he was shot, and in the media they
Yeah,
almost justified it. Well, you know, he's a Putinist because he's opposed to the proxy war, and there was speculation in the media. Oh, this is very dangerous for violence in society because not him being shot, but when he recovers, he might come after the opposition with a vengeance, and he will. So this was the concern. He never did that, by the way, but nonetheless, what a very strange way to react to the prime minister being shot. And again, I see Romania where they first annulled the election results, and now they banned him from even running.
right.
Based on what has already been proven to be fake allegations. I see Moldova, where, well, very openly the election was rigged. Georgia, where they voted wrong and we want the government removed. It's just across the board. All this idea of peace has very much changed in the past. Being a peaceful actor meant you would choose non-violence. You would push for peace. These days, it means to defeat bad guys effectively. So it's a very it's a very strange shift that we have seen, and I see in this country as well, in Norway, we had during the Cold War, peace was assumed to derive from a balance between deterrence with reassurance. So, not provoke the opponent. These days, no one dares talk about provocations at all. They don't even discuss the security concerns of adversaries. It's just our great values and their authoritarian ways. And if we even consider their security concerns, it's almost a betrayal of our values because if we are restrained, that means that we are not pushing our great values in fear of violence. So because of this, we don't fear nuclear deterrence anymore. Instead, we condemn nuclear blackmail. So we have lost our minds in so many ways.
I think that what you're seeing here is what I can only call an extremist foreign policy on both sides of the Atlantic that there's almost no precedent for the extent to which it's true. I mean, the very fact that the whole idea of negotiations up until Trump, and again, we'll see what he produces, but he is negotiating. Up until Trump, the whole idea here is no negotiations. We didn't actually officially sever diplomatic relations with Russia. We might as well have done so because there was no significant diplomatic activity. The embassies existed, but they did nothing, basically. There were no high-level talks of any real consequence, no presidential talks whatsoever. Um, during the height of the Cold War, during Reagan's period, for example, before Gorbachev in the early 80s, there was nothing like this. There was always negotiation that was not reviled, even by the most hardline. Well, there were hardline elements in the Reagan administration who did actually object. The neoconservatives predictably objected to negotiations. But that was not the official policy yet because the neoconservatives didn't have this unquestioned dominance that they have now. And during Eisenhower's presidency, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were negotiations ongoing. And the very fact that you have this kind of extremist foreign policy is very little commented on. This is almost historically unprecedented. And it's remarkable the extent to which this idea has been implanted in Europe as well as the United States and across the political spectrum. And it's accompanied by a very heavy level of political repression to an extraordinary degree. Effective cancellation of elections in a NATO EU country, Romania, is remarkable. And the very thin pretext on which this was done. I've never heard of anything like that. The repression of access to information. In the United States, we have the First Amendment to the Constitution, which means that I can read RT and I can read Sputnik. But I believe, to the best of my knowledge, you in Europe cannot do that. Am I right? You can't read RT in Norway, can you?
We're not part of the EU, but the European
Oh,
Union
sorry.
cannot.
Forgive me.
But
Yes.
yeah, Well,
And
amazingly so. Yeah, they stayed out of the censorship, but but this is why it's quite incredible because at least during the Cold War, we were allowed to know what the Russians were saying. So there wasn't. We were confident at least enough to yeah not have to censor this. And but these days, not only is there censorship against against the Russian media because everything that the Russian publish is by definition propaganda now. So it's very difficult. And also we had a strange thing going across Europe where even if we have our own journalists or academics and they want to explain the Russian position, and again, this should be very common sense in security studies. If you want to mitigate the security competition, um, first you recognize the security concerns of your opponents, so you want to trigger a security dilemma. But it's not even proper to try to understand the opponent. And in this country, our former defense minister, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, she went down to the media, said, "This is not the time to understand; it's the time to condemn." And I tried to explain, we can do both. And but no, every effort if you try to if you try to explain the position of the Russians, it's synonymous as legitimizing it to justify it. Because if you explain what they're doing, then not only are you rationalizing it, but indeed you're supporting it. So it's a way of yeah, pushing a lot of self-censorship. So it's yeah, the free speech is I want to be hyperbolic, call it dead, but it's definitely falling apart very quickly.
yes, it is. I think that one of the positives, if you want to call it a positive, is that my sense is the public is losing interest in this war very quickly on both sides of NATO. And it's happening in Europe, it's happening in the United States. I think that did contribute to Trump's victory in the recent election. I don't think it was the main thing, but I think it did contribute to it. The perception, whether accurate or not, that he's more likely to settle this war and prevent new wars in the future. In contrast to the very, very militaristic Democratic Party, which is extraordinarily militaristic historically. And so I think that when this war ends, and I think it is moving towards ending, that's the impression I'm getting. If whether it's ended on the battlefield or by negotiations, I think it's coming into the end game here. You're going to see a lot of public anger that the Europeans in particular have had their living standards reduced by cutting off of energy, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, obviously done by the Americans or perhaps in league with some European countries, but certainly by the Americans. Uh, they've spent enormous amounts of money, both the Europeans and the Americans, aiding Ukraine, public money, taxpayer money, and then you lose the war altogether. You have nothing to show for it. That'll be very devastating to credibility. In Vietnam, they talked about the credibility gap, that the public was simply losing confidence in anything the government said about Vietnam because so much of it had been exposed as lies. And I think you could see very quickly a credibility gap emerge here. You're seeing I'm sensing a tone of panic among European leaders that Trump may settle this war. And you're getting all sorts of crazy ideas, like the French-British idea to send quote unquote peacekeepers, French-British peacekeepers into Ukraine, which doesn't make any sense militarily, but I think it reflects a certain desperation that we have to do something. And the question is, what are they afraid of? And the claim is that they're afraid of a Russian invasion, that you're going to get the Russians marching on Paris, you're going to get them occupying the Baltics, they're going to occupy Sweden, et cetera, for which there isn't a shred of evidence that the Russians have any interest or capability in doing any of those things. I think the real thing they're concerned about is having to go back to their own populations and explain why for 3 years we have lowered living standards and wasted so much taxpayer money and killed hundreds of thousands of people for nothing and have nothing to show for it because we've lost the war. I think that's going to be very devastating, not just to existing heads of government, but to the whole political spectrum, all the parties that supported it, all the efforts at suppressing discussion, all the propaganda that's been put out, which is extraordinary in terms of its scope and in terms of its mendacity. And I think that's the real fear we're seeing here. But I think it's also, in my view, a source of hope that perhaps the public will will simply not stand for a repeat of this kind of activity and will demand a different kind of policy and a different kind of politics underlying it.
No, you're probably right, but it's also a bit of a shock because after the Cold War, initially, when the United States was pushing this neoconservative ideas, the DPG, for example, in 92, the Europeans were a bit taken back. And especially if you listen to the French politicians at the time, they were suggesting, yeah, the Europeans should come together to have some kind of a balance with the US so it doesn't, so it has some restraints. But after a while, a new idea, a bit of a neocon idea began to take root, I think, which was that there would be an international system based on unipolarity or hegemony, but this would be the global primacy of the political West, which would consist of two pillars: the United States and the European Union, and there would be some kind of a uh, did have different tasks. So the US would effectively, well, make dinner and the Europeans would do the dishes. In other words, the US would come in with the heavy military power and the Europeans could do the peacekeeping afterwards and maybe some economic aid. And this was kind of the division of labor that was envisioned. But anyways, at the root of this, the idea was in this new system, security wouldn't have to depend on taking into account the security concerns of opponents, be it Russia or China, anyone else. Instead, we will start to adjust to the idea that security derived from being so dominant that it didn't really matter what they thought. So I think yeah, this was a key issue. And now suddenly, the United States, in this new multipolar world emerging, and it's starting to be a bit more pragmatic. It can't be everywhere. It has to prioritize. Obviously, the Western Hemisphere, Asia are high priorities. Europe is yeah, not the center of the world anymore. So, and I think this is a key concern as well. When the Ukraine war ends, the Americans will want to pull a bit out of Europe, and so suddenly we go from one of the two pillars of global primacy to now not even being a pole of power in the new multipolar system. So after hundreds of years of being the subject of security, sitting at the table, now suddenly we become the object. It's very, yeah, it's I think it's very difficult, but also uh, I think everyone believing in victory, battlefield sanctions, all of this, they bought into all the narratives. So now, as you said, they have to explain themselves. Why did they sit on the sideline and refuse even diplomacy when hundreds of thousands of men died? What did they do when they saw that in Ukraine the media was shut down, political opposition arrested, media uh, churches were attacked, young men just dragged off the streets into vans and sent to the front line, and all they could say was, "We stand with Ukraine," even when the majority of Ukrainians wanted to start negotiations. And still, to stand with Ukraine only meant one thing, that we continue the war. At some point, there has to be some kind of a, well, I would like to think there's accountability, but I don't really have too high hopes of it. It just seems, yeah, that no matter what direction the public goes, as well, there's no change among political leaders, and it's not just a European thing. I think you see this in the U.S. as well. Keep in mind that when Clinton began all this, humanitarian interventionism and all in '99 in Yugoslavia, people voted for Bush during the election. He was against what he called nation building. So we're not going to do this, but instead, he went nation building from Afghanistan to Iraq. Then you had Obama, who, he's going to provide change. Didn't really deliver. Trump didn't start new wars, but the only time he was cheered on by the media was when he bombed Syria. And then you have Biden. The adults were back in the room was his slogan, and now, yeah, it almost took us to nuclear war with Russia. I mean, this is not what the people voted for. They thought they were getting normalcy. It's a bit of a shame that Donald Trump, the guy from The Apprentice, is the savior now, who's supposed to end the war. I mean, I'm happy. If he can pull it off, God bless him. Let's give him a Nobel Peace Prize. I don't really care about his you know personal, let's say, yeah, in inappropriate manners. But this is I think this is what the world almost needed because he's so crude in many ways that he can get away with everything. But he was also his superpower was, I think, to break away from narratives. He went out and said, "Well, it wasn't really provoked. NATO knew that they couldn't expand into NATO into Ukraine without triggering wars." Um, and yes, suddenly, who else could say these things? Then that's my point with the Europeans. They've been locked into these narratives. If anyone tries to even suggest that perhaps this war was provoked, they would be finished. They would be crucified. So it's very difficult. There's no space for maneuver, and yeah, Trump doesn't seem to have this problem.
Way I would put it is that Trump doesn't have really so much a head for politics, he has a nose for politics. And I think he realized before anyone else did that a large segment of the public, and I'm not talking here about kids on college campuses, but I'm talking about more working class people, including a lot of veterans, were really basically sick and tired of endless wars. Um, I teach in southern Arizona where there's a large military presence. I have a lot of military personnel over the years in my classes, over decades, really. And I'd seen after the war on terror that a lot of the military personnel were deeply alienated from the idea of overseas interventions because they felt they'd been lied to, and they felt basically the whole thing, the war on terror in particular, was a pretext for American overseas expansion, which of course is exactly what it was. I remember I had one student who was in the Navy who was a patriotic type originally, who was asking me if I could give him books on Karl Marx. That's how alienated he was. And I think that Trump realized that there was a certain something out there that was anti-interventionist in the public. And he realized this, I think, before almost anyone else did. And so I think his instincts are not to start any new wars and possibly even wind down those that are currently in existence. It doesn't make him a nice person, and it doesn't mean that he's going to do positive things in the Middle East. I think, unfortunately, the Middle East is going to be just as nasty and supportive of Israel and the nasty things Israel is doing as Biden was. But in Ukraine, I think there really is a possibility. Trump can do what the Democrats never could have done, which is really end this war and possibly prevent new iterations of Ukraine in the future.
Yeah, let's hope so. I did want to ask you about on the topic of the neoconservatism hand in hand with the idealist, because there's some interesting work done by an American scholar, John Hertz, in 1950. He wrote the idealist internationalism and the security dilemma, and he pointed out that the key problem of this idealist, well, internationalist, was that they effectively under any benign internationalist value, they would reject the principle of sovereignty. So, for example, he pointed to in the French Revolution, this was supposed to create a brotherhood of nations, peace. But then shortly thereafter, in 1792, you had the French National Convention declaring that we will come to the aid of all peoples seeking to recover their liberty, and so in the name of freedom, yeah, essentially invite invasion, and he also drew lines to the Bolsheviks as they also initially they were going to suspend. We don't even need a foreign policy. We're going to have a revolution, and then you'll just see our peacefulness. But then instead, in 1917, they already declared that they had a duty, indeed, not just a right, but a responsibility to come to armed resistance if it was necessary to to come to the assistance of the fighting proletariat of the other countries. So suddenly, what was supposed to be the ideologies or idealism of human freedom was then weaponized to mean expansionism. And it seems as if this is a little bit the direction we went especially after the Cold War as well, which is democracy, human rights creates peace. Now we will come bring it to the world. And again, the whole premise, even if this wouldn't be destabilizing enough, the whole premise that this is what drives this behavior of states, the spread of values and idealism, it becomes, well, let's say naive, I think. But Yeah, I guess my last question though would be: do you see any? How do you see the direction of this neoconservatism and the humanitarian interventionism? Have we reached the peak of it? Will multipolarity scale some of this back by imposing constraints, or I would like to think that, but on the other hand, I see now Europe engulfed in, being led by, well, let's call them warmongers, who are incredibly self-righteous, who do not, doubt that they have the moral high ground in everything. But so I would like to be optimistic, but I'm conflicted because reality does not reflect what I would expect to be happening by now.
My perspective on this, in terms of motive, the question, I think one of the questions you're asking is to what extent was an authentic, if maybe misguided idealism was at the root cause of the problem? And I don't think it was. I think for the most part, I think human rights was used, at least certainly at first, and really throughout, very cynically, to justify an objective that was power oriented and to some extent materially oriented. And I say this because I've been through a lot of the archives. I'm a historian, we use archives. At Stanford University, there's a large cache of documents that I've gone through very carefully by the neoconservatives, in particular a group called the Committee on the Present Danger, which was kind of a neoconservative lobby group that lobbied for major expansion of U.S. military power and American intervention overseas. And I've looked at their papers very carefully, and my conclusion is that power was really what they were interested in, power and advancing the interests of the vested interests that backed them. And they saw human rights as a useful rhetorical vehicle to achieve this, as a kind of public relations maneuver on their part. And certainly at first, I don't think it was anything more than that. And I think throughout, it was never really the core motive here. The core motive was American overseas power projection. And that in itself was the main objective. And you had to have a rationalization. It's not enough to say, we want power because we like power or because it benefits the military industrial complex. The public, at least, isn't cynical enough to really go for that kind of thing. Oh, I admit, actually, Trump sometimes in his rhetoric, he references that kind of rhetoric. Trump's an exception, perhaps, but generally speaking, you have to have a principled justification for everything you do in public. As they came up with a principled justification, even if it was insincere, and I think it was insincere, it was their secret weapon all along, and it's still their secret weapon. I think in terms of how it'll play out, the main consideration here is the record. And the record over the last 25 years has been disastrous. So we've had one war after another that has been justified in humanitarian terms for the most part. And it produced humanitarian catastrophe. You had Iraq, killed about 1 million people for nothing, it would seem. You've had, Afghanistan. The Taliban are now back in power after 20 years, and maybe hundreds of thousands of deaths there as well. You've had the overthrow of Gaddafi. Again, it destabilized the whole of North Africa. You've had the overthrow of Assad now, which is probably going to destabilize Syria. We're already seeing the beginning phases of that destabilization. It always makes the situation worse, is what it does, in humanitarian terms. The very people we're supposed to be liberating, women and children and maybe gays and whatnot, these people are killed by humanitarian intervention. And let's not forget, these things are incredibly expensive. The war on terror alone cost, I believe Brown University calculates the numbers. The number I have in my head is at least $5 trillion. That's significantly larger, the long-term cost of the war on terror. That's larger than the GDP of Great Britain. Just imagine what kind of wonderful humanitarian projects, real humanitarian projects we could have done with $5 trillion. Imagine how we could have improved people's lives all over the world with that money. And instead, we just washed it down the drain with nothing to show for it, but enormous numbers of deaths for nothing. And so I think that I'm hoping, and I try and avoid wishful thinking. I've sort of sworn off the idea of wishful thinking. It's just not worth the effort. So I hope I'm not engaging in wishful thinking here. But perhaps what we'll see here is maybe the end of the line for this line of argument. The fact that we were once again promised a grand victory against this evil fascist dictator, Vladimir Putin, who oppresses women, who oppresses all sorts of people, who does all sorts of bad things. And we're going to preserve democracy and all these wonderful things. Anyway, we're going to see what a disaster that is. And we're going to lose the war with nothing to show for it but a lot of dead bodies and an immense amount of wastage and lowered living standards. And in Germany, probably deindustrialization that'll be irreversible. And I think once the public realizes this, realizes how they've been conned and the extent to which they've been conned, I'm hopeful that will really fundamentally change the rhetoric. And they also come to realize that the people who have been leading them are extremely untalented people. And in the United States, there's so much of a tendency to look at somebody like, let's say, Anthony Blinken, who he has a degree from Harvard, he has a degree from Columbia, look at his paper credentials, and he must be a genius. And he's clearly not a genius. Anybody who doubts me about how untalented he is should look at the record of what happened in our evacuation from Afghanistan. Look at some of the videos of our evacuation from Kabul and how disastrous that was. That was not an efficient operation by talented people. That was incompetence. And so I think what you have here is really mediocrity is leading us. And I think the public will finally come to see that. At least that's my hope.
No, definitely some yeah, terrible terrible leaders, but you're probably right about the initial intentions here being power, because Paul Wolfowitz, of course, participated in this defense planning guidance in '92. He was also one of the founding members of the project for a new American century, and I guess if you go through the documents there, it's and yes, statements, it's quite clear that the objective there is, as the name would suggest, to make sure that this coming century, again, it was established in late 90s, would belong to the United States, and advocating for very forceful militaristic foreign policy in order to achieve this objective. But it's no, it's it seemed would think it would be running out of steam at this point in time, if yeah, people are seeing through the rhetoric, and something I think will crack in Europe as well. There's something very dark. I know, just on the current issues, when Trump was pushing for ceasefire. First, the Europeans were, very averse to the idea, but then when they heard it was a ceasefire, and most likely the Russians wouldn't accept a ceasefire without a political settlement, there was a bit of an excitement, and it took me a second to get it. And then you see all the headlines: if Putin doesn't accept ceasefire, Trump must put max pressure. So let's join the war camp again. It's just very sad that this is the only tune we have to play. It's yeah, and I would like to also see better leaders who have some better understanding of history. Besides, again, the only page in their history book appears to be World War II and Hitler. They never get through a sentence without referencing Hitler. It's very sad. This is the extent of the historical analogies, but yeah, there we are. Uh, Anyways, Professor Gibbs, thank you so much for your time. Yeah, hope to be able to speak to you again in the future.
Yes. Yes, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.